The evening lamps are being lit across Victorian Britain, and in thousands of small cottages, narrow townhouses, and crowded streets, families are thinking about the future of their daughters. For poor and working-class girls, marriage was often less a romantic milestone than an important step toward economic survival. During much of the 19th century, a young woman usually had limited opportunities to support herself comfortably. Domestic service, factory work, laundry work, sewing, or farm labor could provide wages. But these jobs were often exhausting, insecure, and poorly paid. Marriage offered the possibility of a household of one's own, shared income, and a degree of social respectability that unmarried women sometimes struggled to obtain. Yet the reality was far more complicated than the ideal. Contrary to popular imagination, most poor Victorian women were not simply handed over to husbands by strict parents. Courtship existed, affection mattered, and many couples chose one another. However, practical concerns were rarely far away. A young man was often expected to show that he could earn enough to support a wife before marriage could seriously be considered. Families might encourage, discourage, or strongly influence a match, but among the working classes there was often less formal control than among wealthy families, whose marriages could involve property, inheritance, and social position. A poor girl might meet her future husband at church, at work, through neighbors, at village gatherings, or during local festivities. Engagements could last months or years, while money was saved for a modest wedding and a place to live. The wedding itself was usually far simpler than the grand ceremonies remembered from novels. Many brides owned only one suitable dress, sometimes not even white. The celebration might consist of a church service, a small meal, and the company of close relatives and friends. Yet despite modest means, the day often carried enormous significance. For a young woman, marriage marked the crossing of a boundary between daughterhood and adulthood. Ahead lay a new home, new responsibilities, and a legal and social identity that would soon become deeply tied to that of her husband. As the quiet streets settle into darkness and the last shop shutters close, we leave these young women standing on the threshold of marriage, about to enter a world whose rules would shape nearly every part of their lives. As the years of girlhood slowly passed, many Victorian young women found themselves approaching the season when family, neighbors, and society began to look at them differently. A daughter who only yesterday seemed a child was now considered a possible future wife. For wealthy families, introductions could take place at dinners, church gatherings, concerts, garden parties, and social visits. For the middle classes, meetings often happened through family friends, local churches, schools, workplaces, and community events. Among the poor, opportunities were even less formal. A young woman might meet a future husband while working in a factory, helping in a shop, attending Sunday services, or simply living on the same crowded street. Contrary to many romantic stories, courtship was rarely a matter of passion alone. Character, income, reputation, health, and family background all mattered. A hard-working laborer with steady wages might be considered a better prospect than a charming but unreliable man. Parents often gave advice, encouragement, or warnings, though their influence varied greatly from one household to another. In some homes, daughters were expected to listen carefully to parental wishes. In others, especially among working families, practical realities often mattered more than strict control. During courtship, a couple might spend months or even years getting to know one another. Walks after church, carefully supervised visits, exchange letters, and occasional outings formed the quiet rhythm of many relationships. Public displays of affection were generally discouraged, particularly among respectable families. A reputation could be fragile, especially for women. A young lady was expected to behave modestly, protect her good name, and avoid situations that might encourage gossip. Yet beneath these social rules, genuine affection often grew. Victorian letters reveal tenderness, humor, longing, and deep emotional attachment between many future husbands and wives. Eventually, if both families approved and finances allowed, an engagement might be announced. For some women, this was a joyful promise. For others, it carried uncertainty, because engagement was not simply a promise of love, but the beginning of a profound change in life. Soon a daughter would leave the household where she had grown up. New responsibilities, new expectations, and a new identity awaited her beyond the wedding day. And as evening settles gently over the gaslit streets and quiet villages of Victorian Britain, Many young women lie awake wondering what sort of husband, home, and future might be waiting just ahead. When a Victorian couple became formally engaged, a quiet but important transformation began. The engagement was not merely a romantic promise. It was often treated as a serious agreement between two families and two futures. For many young women, this period brought a mixture of excitement, anticipation, and uncertainty. The wedding might still be months away, sometimes even years, but already people spoke of the bride differently. She was no longer simply a daughter or a young lady. She was a future wife. During these months, preparations slowly unfolded according to a family's means. Wealthy brides might have trousseaux prepared, collections of clothing, linens, gloves, and household items intended for married life. Middle-class families often saved carefully to provide practical necessities. Poor families might gather only a few treasured possessions, perhaps handmade sheets, simple household goods, or modest gifts from relatives and neighbors. Every item represented hope for the new household that would soon begin. The engaged couple continued to meet, though usually within the social expectations of the time. Letters remained important. Many surviving Victorian engagement letters reveal tenderness, affection, and concern for the future. Couples discussed where they might live, how money would be managed, and what kind of home they hoped to create. Yet not every engagement was carefree. Financial difficulties could delay weddings. Illness, unemployment, or family objections sometimes created uncertainty. Because marriage carried enormous legal and social consequences, families often examined a prospective husband carefully. Was he responsible? Did he drink excessively? Could he provide stability? Such questions mattered deeply. Meanwhile, the bride herself was often preparing for a role she had spent years observing. She watched mothers, aunts, older sisters, and married neighbors. She learned household management, sewing, childcare, social etiquette, or the supervision of servants, depending on her social class. Victorian society expected marriage to change a woman's life profoundly, and many young women approached that change with both courage and apprehension. As the wedding day drew nearer, practical matters occupied much of daily life. Invitations were arranged, clothing prepared, church ceremonies discussed, and travel plans considered. Yet in the quiet moments between these tasks, many brides found themselves wondering about the unknown future, waiting beyond the ceremony. The familiar rooms of childhood would soon be left behind. A different home, a different routine, and a different identity stood just beyond the horizon. And as evening settles softly over Victorian towns and countryside, countless engaged women sit beside flickering lamps, folding linens, writing letters, and imagining the life that will begin when they finally walk down the aisle. The wedding day arrived quietly for some women and with great ceremony for others. Yet almost every Victorian bride awoke that morning knowing that life would never be quite the same again. In villages, towns, and cities across Britain, wedding days often began early. Family members moved softly through the house, preparing clothing, arranging flowers, checking small details that had occupied everyone's attention for weeks. For wealthy families, there might be elaborate dresses, carriages, and large gatherings of guests. For working families, the celebration was usually much simpler, but no less meaningful. A carefully pressed dress, a borrowed ribbon, a modest bouquet, or a treasured family keepsake could carry just as much importance as the finest jewels. As the hour approached, the bride would prepare herself with the help of female relatives or friends. Victorian wedding customs varied throughout the century, but by the later decades, white gowns had become increasingly fashionable, influenced by the example of royal weddings and changing traditions. Still, many brides wore their best dress regardless of color, particularly among poor households. The journey to the church was often accompanied by nervous excitement. Neighbors watched from windows, children gathered along the streets, and relatives exchanged smiles and quiet words of encouragement. Once inside the church, the ceremony itself was usually brief compared with modern weddings. The exchange of vows carried enormous significance, because marriage was not only a personal commitment, but also a legal and social transformation. In the eyes of society, the bride was stepping into a new role with new expectations and responsibilities. After the ceremony came congratulations, photographs in later decades, meals, speeches, and celebrations according to the family's means. Wealthy households might host grand receptions lasting many hours. Working-class families often gathered for simple meals, music, dancing, and conversation. Whatever the scale, weddings provided rare opportunities. for families and communities to come together and enjoy. Yet beneath the laughter and festivities, many brides experienced private emotions. They were leaving behind familiar routines, childhood bedrooms, and the household where they had spent most of their lives. Some felt excitement for the future. Others felt uncertainty, homesickness, or anxiety about the unknown. Such feelings were entirely normal, though not always spoken aloud. As evening slowly approached and the celebrations began to fade, another transition awaited. The guests would eventually depart. The flowers would begin to wilt, and the young bride would prepare to enter her husband's household. Whether that household consisted of a country estate, a comfortable middle-class home, or a few modest rented rooms, a new chapter was beginning. And as gas lamps flickered softly beyond the windows and carriage wheels echoed along cobbled streets, countless Victorian brides crossed the threshold, between the life they had known and the life that was only just beginning. As the wedding guests gradually returned to their own homes and the music faded into memory, the newly married couple entered one of the most private moments of Victorian life. Much has been written and imagined about the wedding night, yet the reality was often quieter and more ordinary than modern stories suggest. For many brides, especially those raised in respectable middle-class and wealthy households, knowledge about physical intimacy had been limited. Victorian society often treated such subjects with silence, believing innocence and modesty to be virtues. As a result, some young women approached their first evening of marriage with curiosity, nervousness, uncertainty, or even fear. Others, particularly among working-class communities where life was often less sheltered, sometimes possessed a somewhat more practical understanding of marriage and family life. Every experience was different, shaped by personality, upbringing, affection, and circumstance. What is certain is that the wedding night marked the beginning of a legal and social partnership that Victorian society expected to last for life. The next morning, the bride awoke not simply as a woman who had celebrated a wedding, but as a wife. This new identity carried expectations that touched nearly every aspect of daily existence. Whether she entered a small rented cottage, a modest townhouse, or a grand country residence, she now belonged to a new household. For many women, the first days of marriage involved learning unfamiliar routines and adjusting to a different rhythm of life. Some couples enjoyed a short honeymoon, a custom that became increasingly popular during the 19th century, especially among the middle and upper classes. Others returned almost immediately to ordinary responsibilities because work and finances allowed little time for leisure. Once settled into married life, the wife usually became responsible for the management of the home. In wealthy households, this meant supervising servants, planning meals, managing household accounts, organizing social visits, and maintaining the family's reputation. In middle-class homes, she often performed some tasks herself while directing limited domestic help. In working-class families, the wife commonly cooked, cleaned, washed clothing, repaired garments, cared for children, fetched water or coal, and sometimes earned money through sewing, laundry work, or other labor. Victorian culture often described the wife as the heart of the home. While such language sounded gentle and comforting, it also carried expectations of duty, sacrifice, and constant responsibility. Yet many women found satisfaction in creating households of their own, decorating rooms, managing daily life, and building families. As evening lamps glowed softly in windows across Victorian Britain, countless newly married women sat beside their husbands in unfamiliar homes, listening to the quiet sounds of the night and realizing that the long journey toward married life had finally become reality. As the first weeks of marriage passed, the excitement of the wedding slowly gave way to the ordinary rhythm of daily life. For a Victorian wife, this was the moment when expectations became reality. Society had clear ideas about what a married woman should be, and those expectations followed her regardless of whether she lived in a crowded city street, a comfortable suburban house, or a grand country estate. The home was considered her domain, and its success or failure often reflected directly upon her character. Each morning brought a long list of responsibilities. Wealthy women supervised servants, planned household expenses, reviewed menus, organized social calls, and ensured that every room reflected respectability. Middle-class wives frequently performed much of the work themselves while also directing one or two servants. If the family could afford help, poor wives faced the heaviest burdens of all. They cooked over coal fires, washed clothing by hand, mended garments, cleaned small living spaces, cared for children, shopped carefully for food, and often contributed to the family income through sewing, laundry work, or other labor. Victorian society praised women who created calm, orderly homes. Books and magazines published endless advice about cleanliness, morality, child-rearing, and proper household management. A wife was expected to be patient, gentle, economical, and devoted. At least in theory, the husband earned money in the public world, while the wife managed the private world of the home. Reality, however, was often more complicated. Many women worked extraordinarily hard, and many families depended upon the efforts of both husband and wife simply to survive. Legally, marriage still placed women in a dependent position for much of the Victorian era, although reforms gradually improved women's property rights. During the 19th century, husbands generally retained considerable authority within the family. A married woman often found that decisions regarding finances, residence, and many legal matters were largely controlled by her husband. Yet within the home itself, wives frequently exercised significant practical influence, especially when managing household affairs. During these early months, many women also began adjusting to married social expectations. A wife represented not only herself but her husband's reputation. Her behavior, friendships, clothing, and conduct were all observed through the lens of respectability. Even simple visits, church attendance, and community activities carried social meaning. Despite these pressures, marriage could also bring companionship, stability, and a sense of belonging. Many couples gradually settled into familiar routines, sharing meals, discussing household concerns, and building a life together one ordinary day at a time. And so, as rain tapped softly against Victorian windows and coal fires glowed warmly in hearths across Britain, countless young wives learned the quiet art of creating a home, discovering that married life was not shaped by grand ceremonies, but by hundreds of small duties, habits, and moments repeated day after day. As the months and years of marriage unfolded, many Victorian women eventually entered the stage of life that society considered one of their most important duties, motherhood. In Victorian Britain, children were often viewed as both a blessing and a responsibility, and a married woman was generally expected to become a mother if circumstances allowed. For many wives, the arrival of a first child brought joy and excitement, but it also introduced new demands, worries, and challenges that would shape much of the rest of their lives. Pregnancy was treated quite differently from the way it is today. Medical knowledge was more limited, and discussions about childbirth often remained private. Women usually relied upon advice from mothers, sisters, female relatives, experienced neighbors, or midwives. In wealthier households, doctors might be involved more frequently, but even among the upper classes, childbirth remained a serious and sometimes dangerous event. Maternal and infant mortality rates were far higher than in the modern world, and many families lived with an awareness that pregnancy carried real risks. Despite these dangers, large families were common. It was not unusual for a woman to give birth several times during her marriage. Some children survived into adulthood, while others did not. The loss of infants and young children, heartbreaking as it was, touched families across every social class. Victorian letters and diaries reveal deep parental grief, even though society often expected sorrow to be carried with dignity and restraint. Once children arrived, the daily responsibilities of a mother expanded dramatically. A wealthy woman might supervise nurses, governesses, and servants who assisted with childcare, yet she was still expected to guide the moral development of her children. Middle-class mothers often cared for children directly while managing the household. Working-class women faced the greatest burdens of all, combining childcare with domestic labor and sometimes paid work. Long days were spent feeding, washing, teaching, comforting, and watching over young lives. Victorian society believed that mothers played a crucial role in shaping character. A child's manners, religious beliefs, discipline, and moral values were often thought to originate within the home. Because of this, mothers carried enormous responsibility for raising respectable sons and daughters. Many women devoted countless hours to reading stories, teaching prayers, mending tiny clothes, nursing illnesses, and guiding children through the first years of life. Yet motherhood was not only duty. It also brought moments of tenderness and affection. Family photographs, letters, and journals reveal mothers who deeply loved their children, celebrated small achievements, worried during illnesses, and treasured ordinary moments together. And so, as evening shadows lengthened across Victorian parlors and nursery rooms, many mothers sat beside sleeping children, listening to the steady ticking of clocks and the fading sounds of the household, knowing that the future of their families rested partly within their patient and watchful care. As the years of marriage continued, daily life often settled into familiar patterns that were far less dramatic than weddings or births, but far more important in shaping a family's happiness. Victorian marriages varied enormously. Some were affectionate partnerships built on mutual respect and companionship. Others were distant, formal, or burdened by financial hardship. Most fell somewhere in between, shaped by ordinary routines that repeated themselves day after day. By this stage, husband and wife usually knew one another far better than they had during courtship. The excitement of the early years gradually gave way to habits, responsibilities, and shared experiences. A husband might leave for work each morning while his wife remained occupied with the household. In working-class families, both spouses often labored long hours, either inside or outside the home. Their lives revolved around earning enough to feed the family, pay rent, and face the uncertainties of illness or unemployment. In middle-class homes, evenings often became an important time of togetherness. Families gathered around the fireplace, read books aloud, played music, discussed the day's events, or wrote letters. Newspapers became increasingly common throughout the 19th century, and many households followed political events, royal news, and stories from across the growing British Empire. Wealthier families might entertain guests, host dinners, attend concerts, or travel during certain seasons. Yet even in grand houses, much of life consisted of surprisingly ordinary moments. Victorian ideals often portrayed husbands as protectors and providers and wives as moral guides of the household. While reality was often more complex, many couples genuinely depended upon one another. Letters exchanged between married couples during temporary separations reveal affection, concern, and deep attachment. Some husbands sought their wives' opinions on business matters, family decisions, and future plans. Some wives became trusted advisors despite possessing few formal legal rights. Of course, not every marriage was harmonious. Financial stress, illness, alcohol abuse, personal differences, or simple incompatibility could create difficulties. Divorce existed but remained socially difficult and legally complicated for much of the Victorian era. As a result, many couples navigated challenges within the framework of marriage itself. For women especially, leaving an unhappy marriage was often far more difficult than it would be today. Yet, alongside the hardships, there were countless quiet moments of contentment. Shared meals, evening walks, children's laughter, holiday celebrations, and years of accumulated memories gradually wove families together. As seasons passed and children grew, the young bride who once entered marriage with uncertainty slowly became the experienced mistress of her household. And on countless evenings across Victorian Britain, after the day's duties had finally ended, husbands and wives sat together beside fading fires, listening to clocks softly, ticking through the night and finding comfort in the familiar presence of one another. As peaceful as Victorian family life may sometimes appear in old photographs and faded memories, every household lived under shadows that modern people rarely experience in quite the same way. Illness was a constant presence in 19th century life. Even the most loving marriage could suddenly be tested by disease, injury, financial hardship, or loss. Families lived with uncertainties that were woven into the fabric of everyday existence. A simple infection, a difficult childbirth, pneumonia, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, or countless other illnesses could change lives with alarming speed. Medical science was advancing, yet many treatments remained limited by modern standards. Doctors often did their best, but cures were not always available. Wealth could provide better care and greater comfort, but even the richest families were not immune to tragedy. When illness entered a home, much of the responsibility for care usually fell upon women. A wife might spend long nights sitting beside a sick child preparing medicines, changing linens, reading prayers, and hoping for recovery. Mothers and wives became nurses long before professional nursing was widely available. Their labor was often exhausting, performed quietly and without recognition. In working-class homes, the situation could be especially difficult. If a husband became ill and could not work, family income might disappear almost immediately. Savings were often small or non-existent. Rent, food, and fuel still had to be paid for, regardless of sickness. Under such circumstances, wives frequently carried enormous burdens, struggling to keep households functioning while caring for the ill. The death of children was another painful reality. Many Victorian families experienced losses that today would be considered unimaginable. A child who seemed healthy one week might be gone the next. Family letters and diaries reveal profound grief hidden beneath the formal language of the period. Parents mourned deeply, even when social expectations encouraged emotional restraint. Black mourning clothing, memorial photographs, and carefully preserved keepsakes became ways of remembering those who had been lost. Yet families continued forward because life required it. Meals still needed to be prepared, work still had to be done, and surviving children still needed care. Victorian people developed remarkable resilience in the face of sorrow, not because they felt less deeply, but because hardship was a familiar companion throughout much of life. At the same time, periods of illness often revealed the strength of family bonds. Husbands cared for wives, wives cared for husbands, siblings supported one another, and neighbors sometimes offered help during difficult times. In countless homes across Britain, love was demonstrated not through grand gestures, but through quiet acts of devotion performed beside sickbeds and fireplaces. And as evening settled over towns and villages and rain tapped softly against darkened windows, many families sat together in gratitude for ordinary days of health, knowing how fragile such blessings could sometimes be. As years passed and households grew, another part of Victorian married life quietly shaped the destinies of countless women. The law itself, while daily life was filled with children, housekeeping, work, and family concerns, legal rules determined who controlled money, property, and many important decisions. These laws were often invisible in ordinary conversation, yet they influenced nearly every married woman's future. During much of the Victorian era, marriage carried consequences that modern people might find surprising. Under traditional legal principles, a married woman's identity was closely tied to that of her husband. In practical terms, this often meant that a husband exercised control over family finances and property. For poorer families who owned very little, these rules sometimes mattered less in daily life because there was little property to manage. Yet for women of the middle and upper classes, questions of inheritance, savings, investments, and household income could become extremely important. Over time, however, change began to arrive. Throughout the 19th century, campaigns for women's rights gradually gained support. Reformers argued that married women should have greater control over their own earnings and property. Several important legal reforms eventually allowed married women to retain ownership of property and income in ways that had previously been impossible. These changes did not create full equality, but they represented significant progress compared with earlier generations. For many wives, money remained a constant concern regardless of legal reforms. Working-class women often stretched every coin to feed growing families. Household budgets had to cover food, coal, rent, clothing, medical expenses, and unexpected emergencies. A careful and economical wife could make the difference between stability and hardship. Victorian advice books frequently praised women who managed household finances wisely, though the responsibility could be exhausting when resources were limited. In wealthier homes, financial matters appeared more comfortable but were not always simple. Family fortunes could rise or fall through business failures, poor investments, economic downturns, or unexpected debts. Some wives found themselves living comfortably one year and facing uncertainty the next. Respectability often depended not only on income, but on careful financial management. Social expectations also influenced women's opportunities. A respectable married woman was generally expected to devote herself primarily to home and family. Professional careers remained limited for most women, although opportunities slowly expanded toward the end of the century. Teaching, nursing, writing, and certain other occupations became more accessible, especially for unmarried women and widows. Yet despite restrictions, many Victorian wives exercised considerable influence behind the scenes. They advised husbands, managed complex households, oversaw budgets, negotiated with tradespeople, and made countless decisions that kept family life functioning smoothly. Their authority was often informal rather than legal, but it could still be substantial. And so, as evening descended upon Victorian streets and lamps glowed warmly behind curtained windows, Many wives sat balancing account books, planning tomorrow's meals, and quietly managing the practical realities upon which their families depended, knowing that security often rested not upon grand fortunes but upon countless careful decisions made day after day. As the years passed and families grew older, many Victorian women eventually faced one of the greatest uncertainties of their age, the possibility of widowhood, because illness, accidents, dangerous working conditions, and limited medical treatment were common realities of 19th century life. Death often arrived much earlier than people expected. For a married woman, the loss of a husband was not only an emotional tragedy but frequently a turning point that transformed every aspect of daily existence. In the quiet hours following a husband's death, grief was often accompanied by practical concerns that could not be postponed for long. How would the household survive? What income remained? Who would provide for the children? The answers depended greatly upon social class, savings, property, and the husband's preparations before death. For wealthy families, a widow might inherit income from investments, land, or carefully arranged settlements. Such women often remained financially secure, though they still faced loneliness and the responsibilities of managing estates or family affairs. For middle-class widows, circumstances varied widely. Some possessed enough savings to maintain a comfortable life, while others found themselves forced to reduce expenses, move to smaller homes, or seek sources of income that had previously seemed unnecessary. Among the poor, widowhood could be devastating. A laborer's wages often supported the entire family. When those wages disappeared, a widow might suddenly face poverty despite years of hard work and respectable living. Many widows earned money through sewing, laundry work, domestic service, taking in lodgers, running small businesses, or relying upon support from relatives. Some older children left school early to contribute to family income. Victorian society treated widows differently from unmarried women. A widow had occupied an honored social role as wife and mother, and her status often carried a degree of respect. Mourning customs were particularly important. Black clothing became a visible sign of grief. Depending upon social class and financial means, mourning could continue for months or even years. Etiquette books provided detailed instructions regarding appropriate dress, social activities, and public behavior during periods of mourning. Yet behind these customs lay genuine sorrow. Many women had shared decades of life with their husbands, raising children, overcoming hardships, and building homes together. Widowhood could bring an aching sense of silence to houses, once filled with familiar voices and routines. At the same time, widowhood sometimes offered a degree of independence that marriage had not always allowed. As legal reforms advanced throughout the 19th century, some widows found themselves managing finances, property, and personal decisions more freely than before. Life remained difficult, but they often gained greater control over their own affairs. And so, as evening shadows stretched across Victorian parlors and clocks quietly marked the passing hours, many widows sat beside fading fires, surrounded by memories of years gone by, carrying both sorrow and strength as they faced a future they had never expected to walk alone. As the years moved steadily forward and Victorian society slowly changed around them, some widows faced a question that earlier generations had considered with great seriousness: whether to marry again. The answer depended on age, financial circumstances, children, social expectations, and personal desire. Contrary to some modern assumptions, remarriage was not unusual in Victorian Britain because death often separated couples relatively early in life. Many men and women found themselves widowed while still raising children or managing households. For a widow with young children and limited income, a second marriage could offer financial stability and practical support. For a widower, remarriage often provided help in maintaining a household and caring for a family. Yet the decision was rarely simple. Widow who had spent years building a life with one husband might feel deep loyalty to his memory. Mourning customs encouraged remembrance, and some women never remarried at all. Others eventually chose companionship again after months or years had passed. Victorian society generally accepted remarriage, though expectations regarding timing and propriety remained important. During the later decades of the 19th century, social changes also opened new possibilities. For women who remained unmarried after widowhood, educational opportunities slowly expanded. Charitable organizations, Schools, hospitals, and certain professions began offering greater opportunities than had existed. Earlier in the century, nursing, teaching, clerical work, writing, and social reform activities became increasingly accessible to some women, particularly among the middle classes. While opportunities remained limited compared with those available to men, change was unmistakably underway for many widows, especially those who inherited property or possessed independent income. Life after marriage brought an unusual degree of autonomy. Decisions that had once belonged primarily to husbands now rested in their own hands. They managed finances, supervised investments, oversaw businesses, and directed family affairs. Some discovered strengths and abilities that society had rarely encouraged them to develop while married. Family relationships also evolved during these years. Children grew into adults, established homes of their own, married and started families. Mothers gradually became grandmothers. Houses that had once echoed with the noise of young children often became quieter. Visits from grown sons and daughters, letters arriving from distant towns, and gatherings during holidays brought new rhythms to family life. Many women found comfort in watching younger generations begin journeys that reminded them of their own youth. Victorian society itself was changing as the century approached its end. New technologies, expanding cities, improved transportation, and growing public debates about women's rights gradually altered the world that young brides had entered decades earlier. Yet amid all these changes, countless women continued to value familiar things: family, friendship, faith, duty, and the quiet comforts of home. And so, as evening settled gently over gardens, villages, and city streets illuminated by ever brighter lamps, many older women sat peacefully beside windows or fireplaces, reflecting upon lives that had carried them through love, loss, hardship, resilience, and change, discovering that even after great sorrow, new chapters could still begin. As the 19th century drew onward, and the once young bride found silver threads appearing in her hair, life entered another gentle season. For many Victorian women, these years brought fewer physical demands than the busy decades of raising children, yet they also carried profound changes. The household that had once revolved around infants, lessons, illnesses, and endless daily tasks slowly became quieter. Sons left home to begin careers, apprenticeships, military service, or businesses of their own. Daughters married and established households not unlike the ones their mothers had, carefully maintained for so many years. One by one, children who had once needed constant attention became adults with responsibilities of their own. For many women, this transition brought mixed emotions. There was pride in seeing children succeed and establish respectable lives. There was also a quiet sense of loss. Empty bedrooms, fewer places at the dinner table, and longer stretches of silence reminded parents that one chapter of life had ended. Victorian letters often reveal mothers speaking warmly of visits from grown children and eagerly awaiting news arriving through the post. A letter from a distant son or daughter could become the most important event of an ordinary day. Grandchildren often brought new joy into these later years. Women who had spent decades raising children now found themselves offering advice, stories, and affection to a younger generation. Family gatherings became treasured occasions. Birthdays, Christmas celebrations, weddings, and christenings drew relatives together, filling homes once again with conversation and laughter. In many ways, older women became guardians of family memory. They remembered births, marriages, losses, and events that younger relatives knew only through stories. At the same time, aging brought challenges. Physical strength gradually declined. Stairs became more difficult, eyesight weaker, and illnesses more frequent. Victorian medicine had improved considerably compared with earlier generations, yet old age still carried uncertainties. Many women spent increasing amounts of time at home, finding comfort in familiar routines. Reading, sewing, correspondence, church activities, charitable work, and visits with friends often filled their days. For those who remained married, these years sometimes brought a deep companionship forged through decades of shared experience. Husband and wife had weathered joys and sorrows together, surviving hardships that younger couples could scarcely imagine. The passions of youth had often softened into something quieter but enduring. They knew each other's habits, stories, strengths, and weaknesses better than anyone else in the world. And so, as evening settled softly over Victorian gardens and the final decades of the century approached, Many older women sat near windows, watching fading sunlight touch familiar streets and fields, surrounded by photographs, letters, and memories accumulated over a lifetime. The world beyond their doors was changing rapidly, yet within the comforting walls of home, they carried the living history of generations, preserving stories that would outlast them long after the lamps had been extinguished for the night. As the 19th century approached its final years, the world surrounding Victorian women began changing more quickly than many of them could have imagined in their youth. The girls who had once grown up under strict expectations entered carefully supervised courtships and married into lives centered almost entirely upon home and family were now witnessing the arrival of a new age. Railways connected distant towns. Newspapers carried information faster than ever before. Cities expanded, education became more accessible, and public discussions about women's roles grew increasingly common. For older women, these changes could feel both exciting and unsettling. Many remembered a childhood in which daughters were expected to prepare almost exclusively for marriage. Now they saw younger women attending schools, seeking employment, participating in charitable organizations, and discussing opportunities that had once seemed impossible. Although Victorian society remained deeply traditional in many ways, the foundations of change had already been laid. During these years, ideas about marriage itself slowly evolved. Romantic affection had become increasingly important throughout the century, and younger generations often expected companionship, as well as practical security within marriage. While economic considerations still mattered greatly, many couples placed greater emphasis on personal compatibility than previous generations had done. The ideal marriage was increasingly described not simply as a household arrangement, but as a partnership between husband and wife. Legal reforms also continued to alter women's lives. Rights concerning property, education, and personal independence improved gradually. The changes were not immediate and certainly not complete, but compared with the world of the early Victorian period, opportunities had expanded noticeably. Women could now imagine futures that included more choices than their mothers and grandmothers had possessed. Yet despite these transformations, daily life remained rooted in familiar realities. Homes still required care, families still depended upon one another, children still needed guidance, and communities continued to value kindness, responsibility, and respectability. The pace of technological and social change may have accelerated, but many of the values that shaped ordinary lives remained remarkably constant. For older women reflecting upon decades of experience, these final years often inspired contemplation. They had witnessed births and deaths, marriages and farewells, prosperity and hardship. They had watched horse-drawn streets become busier, cities grow larger, and society slowly reshape itself. Many had begun life with few legal rights and lived long enough to see the first significant steps toward greater independence for women. As evening settled gently across Britain at the close of the Victorian age, countless women sat beside familiar fireplaces, turning the pages of books, writing letters, or simply watching the fading light beyond their windows. Behind them stretched a lifetime of memories. Ahead lay a new century that would bring changes even greater than those they had already seen. And in the quiet stillness of those evenings, many understood that they had lived through an era that was slowly becoming history itself. As the final years unfolded and the old Victorian century slowly faded into memory, many women found themselves sitting quietly beside the fireplaces that had warmed so much of their lives. The flames were often lower now than in years gone by, the rooms a little quieter, the mirrors reflecting older faces than those of the hopeful brides who had once stepped nervously into marriage. Yet within those peaceful homes lived entire histories. A woman might look around her parlor and see more than furniture and photographs. She saw the dress she had worn as a young bride, the cradle where her first child had slept, the letters exchanged during long separations, the family portraits taken during happier years, and perhaps the empty chair of a husband who was no longer there. Victorian life had not been easy. Women carried responsibilities that often began in girlhood and continued until old age. They kept households running through prosperity and poverty. They gave birth, raised children, cared for the sick, comforted the grieving, balanced family budgets, and preserved the dignity of home through every season of life. Some enjoyed comfort and security, while others endured hardship and uncertainty. Yet across all social classes, from grand country houses to modest city rooms, women formed the quiet foundation upon which much of Victorian family life rested. Looking back, many would have seen a world very different from the one they entered as children. They had witnessed legal reforms, social changes, new inventions, expanding opportunities, and shifting ideas about what a woman's life could be. The daughter who once depended entirely upon her family had become a wife, perhaps a mother, perhaps a widow, perhaps a grandmother, and eventually a keeper of memories stretching across generations. The story of Victorian women was never only about marriage laws, social customs, or household duties. It was also a story of endurance, adaptation, affection, resilience, and countless small acts of care that rarely appeared in official records. History often remembers kings, politicians, inventors, and wars, but behind the doors of ordinary homes lived women whose daily efforts shaped families and communities in ways that were no less important. And so, as the fire settles into glowing embers and the old house grows still, our journey through Victorian womanhood comes gently to its end. Outside, the wind drifts softly through dark streets and sleeping gardens. Inside, the clock marks another quiet hour. The lamps grow dim. The memories remain. Thank you for spending these peaceful evenings beside the fire, wandering through the lives of the women who lived, loved, worked, endured, and dreamed during the Victorian age. If you would like to return for more cozy historical journeys, quiet stories by the fireplace, and gentle explorations of everyday life in the past, then settle comfortably into your favorite chair, keep the fire warm, and join us again for another evening among the whispers of history.